We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America from the Australia Institute. I'm Dr Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs. Well, Election Day is looming. We've only got 3 weeks to go. And at this point, the most important US election in living memory is a coin flip. Some Americans have already voted. Most of them have already made up their minds. And both campaigns are frantically chasing the few who haven't in those key battleground states that we're all now obsessed with.
Boy, this is a big one.
Yeah, Kristen, the numbers say it. It is a tie game here weeks before the election.
It's going to come right down to the wire. We always expected that.
3 weeks from Election Day, and the presidential candidates are crisscrossing the state that could decide it all.
We have to win Pennsylvania.
Generations of Americans before us led the fight for freedom.
His name is Elon Musk. He saved free speech.
As you can see, I'm not just MAGA, I'm dark MAGA.
The future is always worth fighting for.
As we wait to find out what will happen, we thought it was about time we did a proper campaign check-in. And to do that, we're lucky enough to be joined by one of this country's best writers and thinkers. Richard Cooke is a multi-award-winning author, reporter, and screenwriter. Richard is the former US correspondent and current contributing editor to The Monthly magazine, the former sports editor of the Saturday paper, and the former arts editor of Time Out Sydney. He's a Walkley Award-winning writer who has been published by, amongst others, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Republic, Wired, and The Paris Review. His outstanding 2019 book, Tired of Winning, A Chronicle of American Decline, remains my go-to for understanding American politics today. His next book, on Wikipedia, will be out next year. Here's Richard. Hi, Richard, and welcome to After America.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's all ours, all our pleasure to have you. Hey, I wanted to start with a bit of a vibe check because we haven't really done a check-in on the presidential campaign on the podcast for a few weeks, and I forced myself to look at the calendar this morning, which I've been avoiding, and we are only less than 3.5 weeks away, I think, from Election Day. So I really just wanted to ask you how you think the campaigns are tracking, how you're feeling about how it's all going down.
A vibes check on the vibes election.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do my best. I was thinking about this before we talked and thinking about what punditry is like at this moment in time and how it's taking on a bit more of an unusual dynamic. So I'm going to start with that before I give my own vibes for what they are worth. With a couple of exceptions, every election in the 21st century in the US has been very, very close. The exception is 2008. It depends on how you judge it, whether or not you think the Biden win was close. It wasn't close in the popular vote, but on the Electoral College vote, it was extremely close. Something like 45,000 votes in key areas among key people decided who would be president. I think that's what complicates a vibes-based picture of a vibes-based election, is that you have these two dynamics which are kind of diverting from each other. I mean, if this was in a first-past-the-post national system, then Harris would be winning easily. Because it comes down to the peculiarities of a few demographics in Georgia and Pennsylvania, you have this kind of outsized focus on those people. And it's exactly where these decisions are being made that are polled so poorly. State polls are notoriously much more volatile than national polls. And the moment that you start looking at the crosstabs and getting granular on those, it's all over the place. It's also the case that contemporary election campaigns of this kind are better able to do more specific demographic targeting. So this doesn't look like, it's even quite distinct from campaign 4 years ago, let alone 8 years ago, where I think the big difference here is that the role of the media is really diminished. it's really noticeable that the role of the legacy media is diminished. And instead you have Harris going on podcasts like Call Her Daddy and Trump going on Theo Von and Flagrant. And he's just confirmed that he will be going on the Joe Rogan podcast. And realistically, going on Rogan is more important than doing a 60 Minutes interview now. It's going to reach more people. It's going to reach a more engaged audience. And the rationale for doing this media is not just the audience is bigger, but that it can be targeted more specifically as well. I mean, the Harris campaign is looking at the young women who listen to Call Her Daddy or the disaffected Republican voting women and thinking these are the people that we need to reach. That's also makes the vibe harder to gauge because you're picking up these little incremental pieces of media that in some senses are not necessarily designed for you. The vibe might not chime with you as a disinterested observer because you're not the intended audience. The general messaging is now subsumed by the specific messaging. It's sometimes even hard to catch the nature of the general messaging outside things like debates and your classic 60-minute interviews. And instead, you have these sometimes slightly strange events where, Harris is talking about owning a Glock and Trump is talking about what it was like when people around him were doing cocaine in the 1980s and talking to Theo Von about his own cocaine addiction. It's hard to imagine stuff like this happening in the midst of other presidential election campaigns, but that's a sign of the media environment being different. One way to think about it is that instead of doing regional media, there's still some of that, but it's much less important, partly because so much regional media has died. People are doing, in a sense, demographically regional media or demographically focused media to try and have the same effect.
Do you think, though, there's almost an irreconcilable tension in that because you have campaigns kind of speaking, as you said, to extremely targeted audiences while also chasing arguably quite different other targeted audiences. So you have a situation, for example, with the Trump campaign, which is being told from the outside and often from legacy media that it needs to moderate on issues in order to attract or keep aboard, I suppose, Republican women, when it comes to reproductive rights and abortion, that they need to moderate to keep those voters on board. But at the same time, they're going on these right-wing, universe podcasts and talking to a very specific demographic of young white men who are often kind of immersed in that radical universe who they need to mobilize or they think they need to mobilize. Is that tension irreconcilable, or do you think it's possible in this kind of fractured environment for them to be engaging in almost contradictory messaging at the same time?
That's a great question. Voters have a pretty good track record of reconciling the irreconcilable themselves. This is where the leopards eating faces party comes from. This is where the meme, I voted for the leopards eating faces party, not thinking the leopards would eat my face. If you look at growing Trump support amongst Latinos, it's not that they don't think that Trump has said racist things for the most part. They do think that Trump has said racist things about immigrants. They just don't think that it applies to them specifically. And sometimes they're quite energized by, there's something which is called the closing the door effect, where first or second generation immigrants are sometimes quite opposed to migration. I've met people like this in Florida, Cubans who are sort of peeling the paint about Venezuelans coming into the United States. As long as voters are able to think he's not talking about me, they can pass these messages themselves. They sort of understand, I think, to an extent, who and what it's for as well.
Does that mean that you think that Democrats kind of rolling out Liz Cheney while at the same time trying to attract young African American women and men in places like Georgia is potentially an effective strategy?
It's a great question. How much influence do never Trumpers have? I think that their influence seems to be fairly low, but it's crucial. It's a low level of influence on a very important subset of people, where even a few thousand people being swayed in this way could make a difference, right? And that means it's very, very difficult to gauge. We were talking a little before about this specific example where Harris, as part of this outreach, which seems to be predicated on her having historically low support amongst Latinos for a Democratic candidate, she did an event for Univision, which is the Spanish language media organization in the US, the biggest one. And she was kind of doing a roll call about her Never Trump coalition. And she did, Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and a bunch of people who worked for Mitt Romney and the McCain campaigns. And she got to Alberto Gonzales, the disgraced former Attorney General of the George W. Bush administration. Now, I know that that's kind of just one little moment in time at a specific event, but I just can't imagine that there are Alberto Gonzales fans out there hankering to know what he thinks of all of this, waiting to be swayed, especially because, Alberto Gonzales is someone who resigned because of weaponizing and politicizing the Attorney General's office in the way that people are supposed, that this line of attack that is supposed to be happening with Trump. I think that's very different. But you're looking at this going, who is this for exactly? Latino, Spanish-speaking George W. Bush Republicans who are ambivalent or hostile to Trump, who live in Nevada or Pennsylvania, you sort of get into question mark territory, not just who these people are, but where they are. Meanwhile, the promise of both the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign is to put all this behind us. I know that we sort of know that George W. Bush is not out there on the hustings for, that every Republican candidate since has distanced themselves. But it's more than that. The Trump Republican Party is the antithesis of the George W. Bush Republican Party on immigration and on foreign policy. It is not just a repudiation of it, it's doing the exact opposite to what George W. Bush republicanism and conservatism was all about. So sort of going back in time and saying, these Bush administration era people support us, I don't think that is a good look for the Harris campaign necessarily. It just, in some ways, reminds people what they are voting against.
Yeah, and I think, that's, as much as it is a little bit silly and unscientific, that is why I wanted to start with vibes, I suppose, because they do matter. And the weird thing that Tim Walz kind of introduced to the campaign felt like a departure. It felt like a significant change in vibe that was going to influence the election. But I think maybe part of what you were getting at there is that it feels to me like there are echoes of 2016 and Hillary Clinton, right? Because she took, in some ways, a similar approach with that line about, look at all these Republicans who are endorsing me, look at all these people who are on my side, aligned against Donald Trump and his kind of authoritarianism, which I guess is a kind of long way of asking you whether you think this Democratic campaign is substantively different from the other two that they've run against Donald Trump, and what lessons we can see them taking out of those campaigns.
What you're talking about here might be called the Decency Coalition. And you've seen at Harris events, they have, literal signage up saying country over party while they get former Republican officials to talk on their side. Was the Biden win a win for the Decency Coalition? Maybe. It certainly made up a lot of its messaging. And maybe it is enough to win if you're tied to a popular candidate, a historically popular candidate. But it also seems a little bit distinct from Harris's promise, which was, let's leave all this behind. And that includes Biden. But is that enough for her to reach the people, the former Republican voters that she needs to reach in places like Pennsylvania? We're about to find out, but we really only have vibes as a means to check this. There is some polling on it, but when we get down to this level, it's a coin flip.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily close, and I think that's what we're kind of circling around in that, I was looking at polls this morning, which is Monday our time, and Trump is kind of marginally ahead in most of those 7 swing states, but it's within the margin of error. So, essentially we can't know. And I'm sure this happens to you, but I keep getting the question of, we're about to find out. We're gonna know on the 5th or the 6th of November, we're going to have an answer to the question. But of course, because it's so close, we might not have an answer, and we might not have one for quite a while. And even then, it's probably going to be an unsatisfying one. Trump has been out, goading, I suppose, what you call the decency coalition again just this week, talking about having the National Guard or even the military deal with enemies from within, I think was the way that he described them.
It's the enemy from within, all the scum that we have to deal with that hate our country. That's a bigger enemy than China and Russia.
I don't think they're the problem in terms of election day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. It should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military.
Do you think, it's probably 2 questions. Are Americans prepared for what might happen after Election Day? And do you think the media is prepared for what might happen? I ask that because I just keep getting this question about that's kind of loaded with this assumption that we're going to know the next day what the answer is.
This is another issue around the Electoral College, which is, as it takes on more and more importance, there are greater and greater delays in understanding election outcomes. And where kind of hanging Chad phenomena start to play an outsized role as well. If you're down to 45,000 votes, then Trump doing a ring around saying, let's find 45,000 votes can make a difference. Well, as in blowout elections, it's immaterial. Trump's comment about bringing in the National Guard or the military to deal with protesters or leftist agitators, I think he called them, or some version of that. The start of that comment was him being asked about foreign enemies and foreign adversaries, and him saying that he was more worried about internal problems. That's the counter-argument to the decency coalition. The counter-argument that Trumpism has made to the decency coalition is, well, these are the neoconservatives who got us into this mess in the first place. The Trump appeal to so many people, and this is hard to gauge until you're speaking to these people all the time. So many Trump supporters bring up him saying anti-war things. I remember meeting a Trump supporter in New York saying, now he's in, we're not going to have any wars anymore. That is just a huge impetus behind this. So it's not just about what happens after Trump. It's about what happens to this kind of, I know you don't think it's isolationism, so I'll be careful about saying this, but it's what happens to this nativist / isolationist coalition that he has built up. They seem to be willing to have that authoritarianism at home, almost an exchange for that. That seems to be a sort of deal that a surprisingly large number of Americans are willing to make.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think we underestimate the exactly as you identified, the anti-war sentiment and probably sheer exhaustion in the United States and the effect that has, especially in the context of, I think it's 100 US troops being sent to the Middle East, or to Israel specifically, just this week. I guess I'm always reluctant to talk about the way foreign policy influences elections because it's not straightforward.
No, it's not.
it's really not. And particularly, the idea that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was kind of the end of, or the beginning of the end for Biden, I have a lot of frustration with. But how much do you think the United States' role in the world under Biden is kind of playing into that continual support for Trump? Is it the anti-war stuff specifically, or do you think there are bigger motivations around the United States' role in the world that Trump is tapping into?
Yeah, like I don't think these objections are delusional. I mean, Biden has stepped down as the candidate, but he hasn't stepped down as the president. And there's a sort of sensation that he's a little bit asleep at the wheel while the Middle East is doing dress rehearsals for World War III. And one of the simplest kind of most cut the lines of the Trump campaign is Trump would not have let this happen. He wouldn't have let things reach this point. The invasion of the Ukraine, October 7th, these things would not have happened under a Trump presidency. That's something he's said repeatedly. So I agree with you that it's very difficult to gauge the effect of foreign policy and foreign events on a domestic election campaign. But this unrest probably assists Trump more than it assists Harris. He appeals to people who want a particular kind of strong leadership, and dangerous world events are a time that they seek that more than others.
And it is very, very dangerous. I don't think we can overstate how dangerous it is. And I think in the mainstream media, at least, these events are framed as things that kind of happen to the United States, that the United States doesn't have any agency in, particularly when it comes to Iran. And I think you're right to say we underestimate how much Americans see through that, and I think see the appeal of Trump's anti-war rhetoric. And I wonder how much, it's kind of wild to me, because Trump is effectively doing diplomacy at the moment. He's talking to Netanyahu more than Biden is, more regularly than Biden is. He's been talking to Putin as well. And it is kind of extraordinary that technically that's illegal. He's breaching the Logan Act doing that diplomacy. But is that Trump kind of waging a campaign, do you think, almost as the incumbent? Does he have that much authority, you think, to be doing that kind of diplomacy and having other leaders assume that they should be doing diplomacy with him, or they should be interacting with him in that way?
Yeah, the question is, are they doing that because they see him as an easy mark? Or they think that he's going to win and it doesn't hurt them to do it, or for some other reason. There is a sense among Trump supporters that he is a kind of the rightful president in exile. But to give you an example of what we're talking about here, this kind of freelance diplomacy, I'm pretty sure this was on the Flagrant podcast. Correct me if I'm wrong. But one of the comments Trump made then was he talked about denuclearization. And he claimed, he may be lying, that he had been on the brink of getting China and Russia to reduce their nuclear stockpiles. Apparently, the end point of that reduction was to zero, was to denuclearize all the major powers, because all of them privately understood the risks that nuclear war entailed. Now, putting that aside, I know Trump says a lot of things, but I was really surprised afterwards how little that was reported. That is a huge deal that a former president of the United States talked about the denuclearization of the United States military. And it seemed to get very little hiccup afterwards. But that is the kind of stuff which is resonating amongst Trump voters and amongst potential Trump voters who are independents as well.
Do you think that's an indication of a larger victory, I suppose, in Trump's Republican Party? Because there has always been this tension, particularly when it comes to war and the United States' role in the world, in that loose coalition that supports Trump. And you can see that in Project 2025 in particular, where there is some very strong anti-war rhetoric, but also policy recommendations to dramatically increase the United States' nuclear arsenal and pursue a kind of Ronald Reagan-like peace through strength approach to foreign policy. But it sounds like from that that a certain part of that coalition has effectively won the argument in Trumpland. Does that sound accurate to you?
I think so. Yeah, it does. And this is a kind of splintering or factional fight that you don't just see at the presidency level. In some ways, you can understand Vance becoming vice president as a victory for that faction as well. That contest is not just taking place between candidates for vice president. It's also taking place between media figures. So that, in some ways, is a fight between the Murdoch family and Tucker Carlson. And the main breach in that fight is the kind of isolationism we're talking about. You know, we had scenarios under the Trump presidency where Tucker Carlson was ringing up Trump personally to make sure that he didn't do a counterstrike against Iran as a de-escalatory measure. That's very different from what came before. And that kind of head-to-head delineation seems to have predominantly been won by nativists and isolationists when they have faced down more hawkish candidates.
Yeah, I think that's true. And your point about Tucker Carlson is critical because, of course, he's also instrumental in having J.D. Vance as Trump's vice presidential running mate. I think because you've brought up media in that sense, this has to be the bit where I ask you about the role of Elon Musk kind of going all in for Trump, campaigning with him, supporting him on the ground. What do you make of Elon Musk's role in all this? What's he doing?
So, I mean, I wrote a big essay about this. I'll try and keep this brief. And some of the answer is that I'm not sure. But I was sort of a little surprised that no one had done this before Elon Musk. What you might call the celebrity support for Trumpism and for the Republican Party of Donald Trump is very thin. You know, you hit Kid Rock pretty quickly as when you're going down the list of A-list celebrities who support Donald Trump. And the kind of business support for Donald Trump is not what it was. Like the Koch brothers, you know, notoriously despise him, for example. And the big money tends to go towards things like the Heritage Foundation rather than Trump and his immediate affiliates directly. So one of the things that Musk is doing is filling a vacuum. He's seeing a kind of arbitrage that there is a big opportunity for him to become a leading Republican cultural figure almost straight away at pretty low cost if he's willing to wear the sort of personal costs and the costs within Silicon Valley. There was a bit of a kind of brouhaha on X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, about this the other day, where people said that Democrats had pushed Musk to support Trump. And there is some partial truth to that. There were opportunities when Musk was a Democrat or backing democratically aligned candidates for them to give him a bit of a sort of a pat on the back for stuff like electric vehicles. And instead, they seem to have treated him in a way which is a bit insulting. You know, there was an event held by the Biden White House, for example, sort of celebrating electric vehicles, where they took the head of Chevy and said, you know, you're responsible for all of this because of the Chevy Volt. That was because Elon Musk doesn't use unionized labor. Biden's a very heavily union aligned and he's a union enthusiast, you know. So this is a way to sort of snub Musk deliberately for his lack of union labor. But that was part of what made them a powerful enemy. You had some trans issues to that through his family, the own particular proclivities, some of them probably racist of Musk, and you push him into the arms of Republicans. And he's, you know, not someone who does things in half measures. So he has a super PAC himself. There isn't a lot of money going towards the Trump campaign this time around, but that may not hurt it as badly as people think. We've had some fascinating control groups in the 2016 and 2020 election. The 2016 election, Trump had very poor fundraising. And the 2020 election, the Biden campaign had virtually no on-the-ground campaign for most of it because of COVID. So it looks like spending money may hurt you in a presidential election and campaigning on the ground may hurt you in a presidential election. if those priors are any guide.
It is pretty wild to think that $1 billion, which is what the Harris campaign has raised since she became the candidate, may not win a presidential election. That is pretty wild to think about. But I think, Musk kind of inevitably leads us into conspiracy theory, because not only because he's engaging it, but because his platform is engaging in it. You've spent a lot of time on the ground where these conspiracy theories will matter potentially the most, and I'm thinking specifically of places like Florida and North Carolina, which have just been hit by incredibly strong hurricanes, made stronger by climate change. But of course, we've kind of descended into this mire of conspiracy theory where you have figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about the government controlling the weather.
And Donald Trump at a rally just started making up stories about the Biden administration withholding aid from Republican areas and siphoning off aid to give to undocumented immigrants.
Republican Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is now like a big mover and shaker in the Republican Party, is promoting a bizarre conspiracy theory about a mysterious they, suggesting that they are sending hurricanes to Republican areas to impact the election. Like someone is sitting at some computer somewhere pressing hurricane.
The idea of intentionally trying to deceive people in their most desperate and vulnerable moments. And my question is, when did that become okay?
Viewed from Australia, I think it's sometimes hard to understand how bad and how deep those conspiracy theories run. Can you see any way out of that? Or do you think, given, the role of people like Musk, the role of social media and the state of American politics means that's just how it is now, and campaigns just have to, I guess, wrangle with it as best they can, or use it to their advantage, as Trump does?
At first glance, this stuff is extremely worrying, and aspects of it seem to be actively dangerous. This reporting's still being confirmed, but it looks like FEMA, which is the federal agency devoted to disaster relief, had to pull back, or may have had to pull back, some of its operations because of militias potentially targeting FEMA agents for assassination. There have always been things like this, around sort of census agents and things like this, people trying to conduct the census, federal census in the United States. And when you see this amplified on social media, it looks really dire. There have always been a lot of paranoid, crazy people in the United States. It was founded by paranoid, crazy people.
Sure was.
They often then went through series of secessions where people would secede from a colony and then secede from that colony and then secede from that colony over some kind of eccentric, conspiratorial and sometimes paranoid beliefs. Do people who state belief in conspiracy theories always believe them? No. There have been sort of studies which have been conducted to try and pass a stated belief from an actual belief, and they often seem to be two different things. So when it is so exaggerated in a scenario of the kind that you're seeing in Florida, of the kind that you're seeing in North Carolina, the government has an energy rate. That shows how hard it is to say we were wrong. It shows how hard it is to say the lefty peaceniks, the people interested in climate change who warned us about it, were right the whole time. People will get to Jewish space lasers before they get there. But also privately, quietly, you do see changes underneath that. People like that do change their mind. I've met them before. So one way to understand this is these are incongruent beliefs defending themselves and having to conduct a vibes-based defense because they can't do it on their evidence.
Vibes matter.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a kind of aesthetic phenomenon, and it is really concerning. But is there more paranoia? Are there more conspiracy theories in the United States than there were previously? I'm not sure. They seem to have better kind of vectors for contagion, but I'm not sure if they're actually, just because they're more visible, they are much more prevalent than they were. You might see an effect where people lose faith in institutions, including the media and government, and are more driven to this, more vocal about it. But it's very hard to say definitively this is worse than it was before, even if it looks worse.
That's right. It's just another example of how I don't think we're going to have any clear answers this election cycle. There aren't clear answers in American politics. Generally speaking, there are long-term historical trends that are making themselves more obvious, I think, more unavoidable, but you're absolutely right that there aren't those clear answers. So on that potentially very unsatisfying note, Richard Cooke, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
Thank you so much for having me.
This episode of After America was recorded on Monday, the 14th of October. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have happened by the time you hear it. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd be really grateful if you subscribed on your podcast platform of choice. You can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Or you can find us on Twitter @the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.